Welcome back to Grand Tactician Civil War Union Campaign. In our last episode, we had our first major battle of the war, which was an important milestone. It was right here at Winchester. Both of our major armies in Virginia were engaged. The Shenandoah Army actually did the vast, they had the vast lion's shares of the fighting, and therefore took almost all the casualties. And that's why they're still showing a little bit of a skull there for some attrition. They still have a lot of wounded from that battle. But it was successful. It was a minor victory. Didn't quite get the major, but we were getting very close. The army of the Shenandoah, the Confederate army of the Shenandoah, had already retreated away as we moved toward that battle site, and then following its defeat, the Confederate army of the Potomac retreated up the Shenandoah Valley as well. So last spotted, they were both sitting right here around the town of Newmarket, and at least one of them is still there, building a supply depot. I would like to be more active and push on these Confederate armies, either going up the Shenandoah Valley or moving south and potentially taking Richmond, Virginia. That, as I've already talked about, our enlistment contract situation is such that I feel that would be an overextension. Currently, on our enlistment contracts, we're looking at 9 days remaining. And that's across the board. Pretty much all federal troops across, well, not these guys. Apparently New Jersey, on their own, raised a regiment on 36 months. We don't even have this policy unlocked yet. Well, that's interesting. I guess that was done down at the state government level. So we have one brigade that is actually going to stay a decent size. All these others, 9 days, 9 days, 9 days, 3-month volunteers. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to disappear entirely. If you hover over the manpower number at the top in the tooltip, we see current length of contracts toward the bottom. Current length of contracts is 12. That's for anybody we recruit right now. And so we're waiting to unlock the 24-month policy currently being worked on before we recruit new units. Estimated loss of manpower within the next 3 months, 28,000. And that's because of these enlistment expirations. And then we see estimated re-enlistment ratio 44%, which is pretty typical for this early in the war. So we look at, say, Keyes Brigade here, 2,500 men on 3-month contracts expiring in 9 days. So in 9 days, their contracts expire, but 44% will re-enlist under the new terms. So 44% of 2,500 is something like 1,150, 1,200 men, perhaps. So in 9 days, that whatever that amount is, about 1,200-ish ballpark. That's what the size of this brigade is going to be. And that's happening all over the place. I am curious, though. I wonder if we have any more of these long-term brigades hiding anywhere. I almost wonder if that was some kind of a game glitch we just saw on that New Jersey brigade. Okay, we do have some 12-month fellows in the Missouri Army. However, so all these little Missouri volunteer brigades, we've got them for a year or almost a year. However, look how small they are. 500, a little bit less than 600. This one's about 400. I mean, basically the story here is, and they're all from the same state. I will probably just combine all three of these into one brigade as soon as I'm able to recruit a couple more brigades and flesh out the size of this army. That's why these brigades are 12 months. They've already been downsized. Lyon had about 5,600 men. Now he's down to 4,000. So I think what happened here is these three Missouri brigades already reached their expiration. And what we're seeing now is the re-enlisted guys are now on 12-month contracts. Anyway, enough of that. So I have advanced time a couple of days since the battle. And since I'm not kind of doing anything active with these armies, which is a little disappointing because we're right in the middle of the good campaign weather, but I don't really feel like, I don't want these armies to overextend and then suddenly find themselves half strength. So I'm doing the fort building thing over here. I replaced Patterson in command of the Shenandoah Army with Joseph Hooker. That turns out to have been a mistake. Because Hooker, he had good stats and he's got high ceilings. He'll recover them, but he was a colonel. And when I placed him in command of this army, that bumped him up 2 ranks to Major General. And in the process, even though he's a West Pointer, he lost stats he lost 3 or 4 stars. He's got the room to regain that, but he took a bigger loss there than I thought he would. I typically put Hooker in Army or Corps Command pretty early, so that was a surprise. Maybe I should have put him into Division Command and let him fight a battle first. That probably would have been the smarter play. But so Shenandoah Army is sitting here building some fortifications to help secure Winchester, Virginia, and he's got 100% supply, but he's also low on ammo following that battle. There was a supply depot here at Harper's Ferry. However, the Confederates burned that down as they left the area. So he's also building a supply depot. And all this fort and supply depot building is increasing the experience of this army. And in fact, they'll be able to open their first perk slot pretty soon. McDowell's Potomac Army is doing the same thing down here. We've got a big supply depot in Virginia. He doesn't need to build a supply, but he's building a fort here in the Manassas area. McClellan, I just sent him on up to Wheeling to recapture that. He is in the process of doing so. But because Wheeling is still Confederate, a lot of these infrastructure points around here are also Confederate, even though they are in Ohio. And he's got a little bit of a supply flow problem because he can't draw on any of these infrastructure points around him because they're considered Confederate owned. I don't really want to build a supply depot up here because I don't intend for him to stay here. But I think once he captures the city, that should open up some supply and he'll recover his situation there. Once that is done, I intend to move him back down to Grafton. Over in the west, the Missouri Army, now down to 4,000 men, has reached its spot near St. Louis, is in a great supply situation. So now he's going to do the same thing. Start working on forts to safeguard St. Louis. Let's put a fort here so that it also covers the river. It can cover both of these routes coming up from the south, and it'll be on the riverbank too. So that's a good spot. And then we'll put another fort right about, well, I don't have the command radius to get up here. Put a fort right about there to guard this route coming from the west. That'll take about a month and a half to build these. Once these are done, then Lyon can come up here, and we'll put a fort here in this area to guard against any Confederate forces that may cross the Missouri and come from this direction. And then it'll be another fort covering this spot where the Mississippi and the Missouri come together. And I think that should be pretty good for the defenses in the west for this pretty important city. Had talked earlier about how I put together a bunch of little river scouting squadrons. Those all reached green readiness and collected up their 3 or 4 little ships apiece, and so they have gone out to their assigned positions. There's a squadron here on the Missouri kind of watching this area here. I don't know how far up in here he can see. I think this squadron is still moving, bringing him down the Mississippi, probably to about here. There is a fort here north of Memphis. He's not going to be able to go farther than that. Riveron 2, Riveron 4, taking their spots on the Tennessee and the Cumberland River, just north of these forts, which are Fort Henry and Donelson, and also Fort Hyman. They're not going to be able to do anything about them either, and cannot go further up these rivers until these forts are taken care of, which is going to have to be done by an army that does not yet exist because we're waiting for our policy to recruit it. Riveron 6 is just kind of sitting here, seeing what he can in the Kentucky area from the Ohio River, which isn't very far south of Louisville, but it's more than what we had before. And I'm bringing Riveron 5 over here to see whatever we can into West Virginia to help out the intel for McClellan's army. It would be really cool if this river were navigable. This is the Kanawha, the main river in Western Virginia. If I could, if one could run a little squadron up here and kind of watch kind of in this area, Charleston, that would be very helpful. But This river is not navigable. Same story over here in the east. The squadrons that we organized up here in Maryland and Virginia have come down, and they're now in their watchdog positions. On the Potomac here at this crossing, on the Rappahannock as far up as we can go, I kind of feel like the Rappahannock ought to be navigable by little ships further up than it is in this game. It seems like they ought to be able to get up as far as Fredericksburg. It's a pretty wide river. Squadron here on the York, not too far from Richmond, and 2 squadrons here on the James. 1 squadron here, and this squadron is going as far up as he can sail, which is out here west of Richmond. So all these little scouters will help with our view of what's going on in Virginia. And meanwhile, most of them had done it already, but all 6 of our seagoing blockade squadrons have reached their positions and are blockading the ports which they are assigned to blockade. And that's kind of where we're at. Still about 3 weeks remaining on the Militia 3 policy, at which point I will begin recruiting troops. So, barring any aggressive moves by the Confederacy, I don't think much is going to happen in the near term while these 2 Confederate armies are up here in the Shenandoah recovering and building their supply depot. Now, once they're done with that, they may very well come right back down on Winchester and attack now Hooker again. That's a possibility. And in fact, I had placed McDowell's army in defensive mode. However, okay, defensive mode, as I read that tooltip, does not prevent reinforcing. So he can still reinforce if Hooker gets attacked. So there's a little bit of a lull kind of going in the action right now. And so pretty soon we are going to start recruiting a bunch of new units into the federal military. And the button clicking for all that will be off camera. I'm not going to do all that stuff in recorded footage because it's a little stale. But I thought it would be worthwhile to kind of go through the kinds of forces that I intend to build over the long term, kind of the Army force structure strategy over the course of this entire campaign. So, let's take a look at that. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but since I don't intend to do a lot of showing, recruiting brigades and all that, weapons and picking officers and stuff, I don't intend to show a lot of that on in the videos, but I just want to kind of lay out the concepts behind how I'm going to organize these forces. And so these are kind of the things I think about that I've learned to learned to think about through trial and error. and how to put these forces together. The command radius of the generals is a factor. You only have so much room, and the bigger a division gets, or the bigger a corps gets, the more units get out toward the edge or outside the edge of the next higher commander's radius, and you get a lot more order delays and not being able to use certain movement actions like advance and so forth. And so this is one factor, how flexible a division is, or a corps is, just moving them around tactically on the map during battle. Cost, weapons availability, self-explanatory stuff, transport capacity. I only recently learned that one transport point carries 200 men. So that's a factor. If you've got 100 rail transport points capacity, you can carry, what would that be? 20,000 men via rail without penalty. You can carry more than that, but it will be slower and it will cost more. And of course, every unit's got to have a commander, and then you've got the command hierarchy. So, how big is the officer corps? And within that overall officer corps, how many, good commanders do you really have? That's a factor. And then the biggest thing is, I do not want to have to resort to the draft. Nor do I particularly want to have to resort to enlistment bounties in order to increase the volunteer manpower pool. Both of those actions greatly increase the number of soldiers available by a huge amount, especially the draft. However, the morale of those troops just goes in the tank. It's significantly lower, and you wind up in these situations where you've got perfectly fresh, supplied, well-rested troops, and you go into battle, and you've got a whole bunch of them flashing red because they're already wavering. And it's not because of their condition or any of that. It's just because they're draftees and they don't want to be there. So I really want to avoid that. And over time, this is kind of the organization that I like. A so-called triangular division based on threes for the infantry. 3 divisions of 3 brigades each. You get much bigger this, either more divisions or bigger divisions with more brigades, and it just gets a little unwieldy. Moving them around the map. This is an organization that I like. Total of 9 infantry brigades, 6 artillery battalions, 3 of which operate together as a division, kind of a grand battery, and this is where I put the better guns, the rifled guns. And then 3 other battalions that operate with the divisions. They're more spread out, they're closer to the line, and these are smoothbores because they're closer. We don't need the range, and smoothbores also tend to be a little bit better at canister, and these are the battalions that are more likely to get in situations where they're close enough to fire canister. And then a couple of brigades of cavalry for flank attacks, for pursuit toward the end of a battle, and for scouting at the beginning of the battle. I think this is a core organization that works. But when I did my CSA campaign, recently finished up, I was a little worried that this was slightly too big because of the Confederacy's smaller resources in economy, weapons availability, and manpower. Because this is a 33,000 man corps. And not only is it the cost in creating such an organization, but it's also the cost to supply it and to move it by rail. So I wanted to do something a little smaller, and I came up with this. And this is what I used in my last campaign. Still 3 divisions, but 7 instead of 9 brigades. 1, not 2, brigades of cavalry. And I've still got the 6 artillery battalions, but the kind of direct infantry support battalions, I used horse artillery because they are smaller. So less men, less horses, which is another factor in the supply situation, and eating less forage. And this organization worked well during that campaign, mostly. The infantry piece was fine. And, I found that 7 brigades did really just as well as 9. Maybe in a really tough, extended firefight, it gets a little hairy because there's less brigades in reserve. But this worked fine, and I think I'm going to continue to do an organization like that for the infantry. For the artillery, I wasn't a big fan of the horse artillery. And for some of that campaign, that was largely due to there's a little glitch in the recruiting tool. If you use the quick recruit tool, it appears to be a little glitched for horse artillery. Works fine for the other types, but these are already small units, even when they're full size. And the recruiter recruited half-size battalions. So these were like 50 men with 4 guns. Not very effective. But even after I corrected that and did have full-size horse artillery battalions in the armies, in the corps, I still wasn't a big fan of it. They're smaller, and because they're infantry support, these battalions tend to be a little bit closer to the enemy than the full regular artillery battalions further back. Which means they take more fire, and they're small, and they're a little fragile. So it wasn't a good match of unit capability to their intended role. So I am not going to do that again. And then the cavalry worked fine. However, I want to go back to 2 brigades of cavalry per corps. But I want them to be able to operate independently of each other, because a corps has 2 flanks. So I want some cav on the left and some cav on the right. I may have 2 or more different roads in different directions that I want cavalry to scope out, and they kind of need a parent division commander nearby in order to do that effectively. So what I'm going to do, kind of the standard corps structure that I'm going to use for this Union campaign, looks like this. The 7 brigades, and the idea being that the 3 brigade division, is kind of the central line holding brigade, and then 2 brigade divisions on either flank. So this is kind of the anvil force. And these two smaller divisions will get priority for higher firepower weapons and will serve as kind of the hammer forces. Still the 6 brigades. I'm going back to all regular artillery, 3 of which will get rifled cannon and will operate together as sort of a grand battery. And then the rolls, the other 3 will still operate in support of the infantry, but administratively I'm putting all the artillery in one division because this division commander is going to be an artillery guy. And usually, when I had the batteries in the divisions themselves, I was still detaching them all the time, not to operate in a different place, but just because I didn't want the artillery limbering up and unlimbering and just moving with the infantry all the time. So they were still a little bit kind of having to micro them a bit, and I figured as long as I'm doing that anyway, I'm just going to have all the arty under one commander. Going back to the 2 cav brigades, but I'm actually going to go with 1 brigade divisions instead of 2 brigades in 1 division. That does mean I have to use more commanders that way, but this way both of these cavalry brigades can operate well away from the army, outside the corps commander's command radius in different directions, but because they have a division commander with them, they're still pretty responsive, and I can keep them doing things effectively without having to wait forever for orders to come from halfway across the map. So this is the organization that I'm going to try in this campaign. I'm also thinking of trying cavalry corps, which I had hoped to do in the last Confederate campaign, but it didn't last very long, and basically the war ended before I got enough cavalry weapons to even put these things together and recruit them. So hopefully I get a chance to use something like this in this campaign. And I'm making it pretty big, 6 brigades of cavalry. And this is subject to getting enough cavalry weapons to adequately arm these. I'm not going to send out cavalry corps with a bunch of mixed cavalry weapons. And of course, the first priority for our cavalry is to give the infantry, the regular infantry corps, their cavalry capacity. So this is going to be later in the campaign, probably in the latter half of 1862 is, I'm guessing, when these will start showing up. But I want them pretty big because, I want them robust enough that if this is the corps that makes the first contact, that they can kind of hang on and fight effectively enough until reinforcing infantry corps come to take over the fight. And I thought, if I go with like 3 or 4 brigades, they're not going to be able to do that. But I think 6 cavalry brigades can fight for a little while on first contact. So that's this is what I'm thinking of for a cavalry corps. And then finally, there's always kind of forts that need building and supply depots and a few little small engineering corps. They just always, having something like this is always kind of useful. Now, just for building stuff, all you really need is just 1 unit, 1 small size infantry brigade. but I'm making these a little bigger, giving them a couple of brigades of infantry and 3 artillery for 2 reasons. Number one, they're still independent forces on the map, and they actually get pulled into battles as reinforcing units fairly surprisingly often if there's any other forces in the area. And so they can, basically they can provide another grand battery of artillery that comes with its own infantry escort. And so they're not an independent combat force by any stretch as far as tactical battles go, but they contribute something when they get pulled into a battle with the other regular corps. And then the other reason I'm doing this is because artillery is a big factor in siege warfare. And while a force of this size can't do anything in a tactical field battle, I think this organization might be able to effectively siege down one of the smaller forts. The forts aren't all equal. A lot of the forts pre-existing, pre-war forts, older forts, especially along the coast primarily, those are big, elaborate masonry fortifications. And a lot of them have fairly substantial garrisons in them. Places like Fort Monroe for the Union, and, well, now Fort Sumter for the Confederacy. I don't think a force like this would be able to easily knock one of those out. But the forces further inland and all the forts that are actually constructed during the campaign, those are less elaborate affairs. They'll have a garrison of like 50 or 75 men, just like 4 guns or so, and they're not brick. They're kind of earthworks and maybe some wooden palisade. And I think an engineering corps of this size can do some siege warfare against that kind of fort. So, this is kind of my idea for the standard combat infantry corps, an independent cavalry corps that will operate within the army structure, a few little engineering corps like this for building stuff, sieging forts, and contributing some extra artillery to field battles. In big picture, how much of all this do I need? So I kind of think of the map in 5 different areas. Right along the coast, Virginia, North Carolina, and eventually down maybe even to South Carolina. The main theater in the east, which is primarily Virginia, and hopefully later on into like North Carolina. Kind of in the middle of the map, you got the mountainous areas, the West Virginia, the East Kentucky, the East Tennessee, and there's always kind of stuff going on in there. It's smaller scale, but you need a kind of an independent force there, or I do. I think I do. The main West Theater, this is like Kentucky and Tennessee, an army there of multiple corps. And across the Mississippi and along the Mississippi River, primarily Missouri for now, need a force over there. And this kind of matches up with what we have now. We have 2 armies, which will eventually be corps-sized units under a bigger army. So we've got 2 in the east. We've got 1 in the Appalachians, McClellan's little force in West Virginia. We haven't recruited anything in this area yet. And then this force would be like Lyon's little army at St. Louis. So maybe 3 infantry corps for Virginia, plus a cavalry corps and one of those little engineering corps. 1 corps to kind of bop down the coast, do things like capture Norfolk, capture Morehead City, capture Wilmington. Probably not a lot of combat for this guy, but maybe some fort sieging to be done. One independent corps kind of in the middle of the map, working in the mountains. Not more than that because, there's not a whole lot of supply in those areas. So just one corps, I think, should be enough. At least a 2, maybe a 3-corps army in the Tennessee-Kentucky area with a Cav Corps and an engineering corps. And then one force out there in Missouri. And then, maybe another infantry corps somewhere, wherever it feels like it's needed. Another cavalry corps, maybe as a raider, independent. Another engineering corps. If I built something like this, which would take a while, well into 1863. But that would wind up being a little over 300,000 troops. And quite a few commanders, 264. So a lot of the commanders in this overall military won't necessarily be very good. But as far as the overall number of troops, about 300,000. The Union can pull that off with volunteers only. Now, the Union can build a much larger force than that, but would need the draft to do so. Anyway, those are my thoughts on kind of where I'm going with recruiting and organization and where I'm putting armies. And it's just conceptual. It may not look exactly like this or even loosely like this, but this is what I'm thinking now. These X's, the 4 X's are armies, the 3 X's are corps. Now, right now we don't have the Army Corps structure, but we will pretty soon because we talked about the Military 2 policy. Even in areas where I only have 1 corps operating, like Missouri, I'm still going to have a higher Army commander over those units. It won't be an independent operating corps. And that is for 2 reasons. Number 1, you get a pretty big morale bonus from being within range of an Army commander. An independent operating corps would not have that. Second, the Army commands, they also have perk slots. So if you have an independent corps operating alone, and he opens all his perk slots, he's got 3 perks. If he's got a boss nearby, within range, that's another 3 perk slots. So now this corps will be operating under the benefit of 6 perks once they're all unlocked, instead of 3. It's just additional perks, and will make this corps more effective. All right, so that's kind of the overarching concepts behind how I intend to build the armies during this campaign. And I spent some time doing that because I just kind of wanted to lay it all out kind of cohesively rather than talk about it piecemeal over different videos as we continue. So probably a little boring for a lot of people, but hopefully that is illuminating at least to a few of you. All right. All right, so we're back on the campaign map here, and I'm just going to advance time for a bit, see what the Confederates do while we're doing all of our sitting around and waiting for contracts to expire and fort building and crap like that. And may not have, well, let's see now. So our river squadron on the James has now caught sight, at least the general area for the Army of the Shenandoah, no longer up here now down west of Richmond, on the back on this side of the Blue Ridge. The supply depot is still being built. I think we can safely assume that the Confederate Army of the Potomac is at that spot. Historical flavor headline. I don't think that means anything for gameplay. McClellan's still capturing Wheeling, Virginia. He's captured fast. The supply situation is deteriorating. Wonder if I can get better information on this army if I bring it up the river to here. I'm also kind of curious just how far up the Ohio can we sail? Looks like as far as this bridge up here at Steubenville, I think. Still a question mark on information, but we're getting timely, almost real-time reports from the squadron on the position of this army. And now he's gone out of sight here. Okay, McClellan has captured Wheeling, Virginia, which apparently did not help his supply situation at all. And I don't have a supply depot down here at Grafton. Crap. Just build a depot here. No, let's do this. Let's bring him down to Marietta. Maybe he'll have better supply here. And if you can use the river to get there, do that. That'll be quicker. Okay, Mac, is that any better? No. Alright, then I'm going to do it this way. Come here. And I know it's crappy attrition, but Okay, so supply situation's a little better here. But we'll build a depot here instead of up at Wheeling, because that can then support his move down this road to capture Charleston, Virginia. I think that makes a little more sense. Hooker's not getting all the supplies that he needs. However, he's just about done with his depot. So the Confederacy was working on the same policy that we are, and they now have 2-year contracts available for them. Basically the same policy. For some reason in the Confederate tree, it is shown in years. 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. And in the federal tree, it's shown as months. 12, 24, 36. How close are we? Pretty close. 9 days left. And oh, by the way, yeah, Potomac Army is down to below 20,000. Hooker's down to below 10,000. And McClellan is actually not that much smaller. Oh, he had some, I don't think I checked him before. He's got some 3-year volunteers. This unit from Ohio. Okay. So there's some long-term troops here with enlistments longer than we have a policy for. In any case, I know not too much happening in this episode after that first battle last episode. Just kind of consolidating. Just laid out the thoughts on the Army. And I think that will do for this episode. And in between, I'll probably just run time off camera for a while until we get closer to some more action on the campaign map. And perhaps by then I will have begun recruiting some armies. And the first priority is going to be kind of making sure that these two armies are sorted. Maybe some brigade combining in here. You know, kind of some brigade combining and adding a little bit more force to this Missouri Army, which is way too small right now, even for its relatively defensive role. And then the big thing is to get an army recruiting in this theater to operate in Kentucky and then Tennessee. Probably we'll first base them at something like Evansville. I don't think I can actually recruit an army in Kentucky, even though it's a Union state. Maybe I can. I'm not going to do it. I'm just looking to see if it's possible. No, yeah, I cannot recruit a new force in Kentucky. So we'll start putting that together in either Indiana or possibly Ohio. And with that, thank you very much for watching.